The United States has a long and illustrious history of farm distilling. Since long before we became an independent country, the immigrants who'd complete our great melting pot of a nation have been turning the great agricultural produce of our land into alcohol for both medicine and recreation. The Irish, the English, the Dutch, the Scottish, the Welsh, and the Germans all brought their knowledge of the art to this endeavor. Distillation truly being agricultural, no Hoosier history book should ever be considered complete without a full study of the economic effects of distilling on our state in its infancy and in its future. While you might be familiar with other distilling states and their contributions, you are unlikely aware of our own importance in the pre-Prohibition distilling industry. We have just as deep and fascinating of a history as any other state. We simply lacked a great publicist after Prohibition. You're likely familiar with Kentucky and her great bourbon industry. You might even be familiar with George Washington and his distillery in Virginia. Or perhaps you're aware that both Maryland and Pennsylvania have great rye traditions. But alongside all of those categories should rest Hoosier apple brandy. From 1855 to 1914, 155 legal distilleries and countless illicit distilleries dotted the landscape of southern Indiana, in a region known as the Black Forest of southern Indiana. Why the Black Forest, you might ask? Simply because the ancestors of most of the people who settled here were from the Black Forest of Germany and brought with them their long tradition of distilling brandy and rye whiskey. The six-county region that made up the Black Forest: Washington, Orange, Lawrence, Crawford, Harrison, and Perry County. Each of which, if you go back to the county census books, the county agricultural census books of the mid-1800s, had upwards of 155,000 apple trees per county. None of these apple trees were for eating. None of them were bred for cider. Cider was never a popular item in southern Indiana. These apples were grown from seeds started by distillers expressly for the use in distillation. These distilleries were producing between 300 and 1,200 barrels a year in a season that ran from roughly August until January. To put that in perspective, each gallon of brandy that was made required 1 to 3 bushels of apples to make 1 single gallon of brandy. This Black Forest of southern Indiana was actually the largest producer of apple brandy in the entire world for much of its run. Today we ask you to join us in visiting one of the most important brandy distilleries in southern Indiana, located at Spring Mill State Park. This is what was once known as the Daisy Spring Mill Distillery. Good morning, everybody. Checking in from beautiful Spring Mill in Lawrence County, Indiana. Indiana, as you know, has a very long history of distilling, especially southern Indiana. And there are many historic buildings in southern Indiana. And there were many distilleries in southern Indiana. But very few hold a special place in my heart in particular, as does what I'm about to show you right now. This is the old Daisy Spring Distillery, one of only 3 existing buildings from the 155 working distilleries that dotted a 6-county region: Washington, Orange, Lawrence, Crawford, Harrison, and Perry County between 1855 and 1914. This is the most intact of those 3 remaining buildings. And I wanted to take a moment today to share a little bit of that history with you. So come right along with me. My name is Alan Bishop. I am the distiller at Spirits of French Lick in West Baden, Indiana. Also the writer of the alchemistcabinet.wordpress.com blog, all about Indiana's distilling history. And the leader of Hell's Half Acre, which is a historic distilling reenactment group. The history of the mill and village has been well documented, from the land claim placed by Naval Officer Sam Jackson in 1814 and his 15-square-foot grist mill to the acquisition and expansion by the quote-unquote merchants of Louisville, the bullets in 1817, to the purchase in 1823 by the Montgomerys, and the implementation of the first distilling operation that we know of on the site, our story really doesn't begin until 1832, when Hugh Hamer and Thomas Hamer purchased the property. Hugh having been the miller and distiller at the nearby Old Clifty Mill and Distillery in Cave River Valley under John Hammersley, who himself had worked as a millwright for the Montgomerys on the mill. Hugh knew a thing or two about making whiskey, having had a major hand in the operation at Old Clifty in the Hop Thompson district of Campbellsburg, Indiana, alongside Hammersley, who came himself specifically to Indiana to set up and subsequently flip mills and distilleries to new owners in the Hoosier Hills. Hugh, a poor man himself, essentially early on in servitude to Hammersley, bought the property for nearly nothing, as rumors of the mill's structural instability had essentially scared the Montgomerys from their new investment. While we don't know the year of manufacture or the provenance of the 100-gallon copper pot still on the property, we do know it is historic to the site. It is hand-hammered from a solid sheet of copper, with rivets placed simply for decoration. This, a hallmark of Eastern European quote-unquote tinkers, or metal workers between 1806 and 1820. The original head is missing, and the current setup is not historic. But the story of this distillery and pot still is not yet over, as efforts are in place by staff, Indiana DNR, and private individuals to restore the distillery to historical accuracy and perhaps one day functionality in order to help fund the park. Every distillery needs a great distiller. First was Mr. Wesley Klaus until 1847. Then came the legendary William Dalton, who worked the distillery for 55 years, the longest tenured distiller in the history of the Hoosier State. The man who made Old Hamer whiskey, the real deal, famous. Much of this whiskey was traded locally, but even more was delivered south with the spring floods via flatboat to New Orleans. In 1853, the New Albany and Salem Railroad bypassed the village in favor of nearby Mitchell Crossing, changing the economy of the village forever. The cutoff of southern markets, where the whiskey was so popular during the Civil War, certainly didn't help matters either. Days were dark for the village, the distillery, and the mill. But it wasn't long before an enterprising man named Jonathan Turley stepped in to kick the distillery into high gear, alongside Solomon Scott of Paoli, Indiana, himself later to become a legendary moonshiner and folk hero. They made apple and grape brandies that became renowned all over the Midwest, 135 gallons worth every day on small copper pot stills. The distillery closed April 28th of 1896. Turley passed a few months later, possibly of a broken heart. Limestone water is a hallmark of all great whiskeys. Fortunately, the property is dotted with caves, and the water and the power it could provide for industrialization and the base for high-quality whiskey was easily accessible and put to its best advantage. The water provides the appropriate pH and nutrients to yeast during the fermentation process, the process by which sugar, after having been converted from starch and stored grain, is further broken down into CO2 and subsequently alcohol. One living aspect of the Daisy Spring Mill Distillery's history is that the very same single-celled organism, the very same yeast used by the legendary William Dalton, was captured from wooden fermenters extant on the site last year by myself and has been put to use at Spirits of French Lick Distillery in nearby West Baden, Indiana, in a tribute to the whiskey made at this magical place. In order for a village to survive and be economically prosperous, everyone in a village must have a job. And if you're going to have a mill, you're more than likely going to have a distillery, because everything works off of agricultural trade, as I said earlier. Here at Spring Mill, there was actually a cooper on hand who made both dry coop barrels and wet coop barrels for trade. These are actually some of his tools that would have been used here at the Daisy Spring Distillery to create the barrels they would have shipped their apple brandy and their Old Hamer whiskey in. Various planes, shapers, etc. One of the coolest things that they have here on display, in my opinion, and I've only ever seen two of these ever, one for the old Lambden Distillery, the C.S. Lambden Distillery in Orange County, and the one for this distillery is this barrel brand. This says copper distilled. They were incredibly proud of the fact that they had copper pot stills, and they made sure that they branded every single barrel that went out of this little village, out of this little valley, as copper distilled as part of their branding. Now this is a much more modern still, but still a piece of Hoosier history. Unfortunately, I do not have any information on this still, but this is probably a Prohibition era still. It's obviously a little worse for wear now, but I'd love to know the story of it, where it came from, who had it, who ran it, and what was made on it, because that's as much a part of our history as anything else in this building is. One of the major components of the time the distillery was in operation underneath Jonathan Turley as the owner was the implementation of the production of a lot of apple brandy. In fact, the very last thing that was shipped out of Spring Mill, or let's call it Daisy Springs Distillery, was apple brandy before the distillery closed down. This is a smaller sized version of basically an apple grinder and an apple press. Around here in southern Indiana, pretty typically, we did not make apple brandy the way we might think of it nowadays. The way we think of it nowadays is that people are taking pressed apple juice and fermenting that and turning that into a distilled spirit by double pot distilling it. Double pot distilling was always the methodology used here in southern Indiana, or nearly always, until the invention of what was later introduced called the three-chamber still. But the basic concept of a device like this is the apples would be brought in, they'd be placed inside, you would then turn the wheel, and this one's a little tight, but the apples would be ground up by that wheel on the inside. As they were ground up, if one so choose, they could then take and put them into this press and press the juice from them. The Hoosier style of apple brandy was very rarely from a pressed juice, however. Especially when crops were coming in and distillers were in a hurry to get through their process, their season running basically from August until January every year. They basically ground those apples up, and then they would take them and they would throw the apples, all the apple, including the skin, into their fermentation vessel. They would scald that with boiling water for 20 to 30 minutes, and then they would top it up with good cold limestone water and either use the yeast they had on hand and or use the natural yeast that was in the air. So, as some of you may or may not know, we actually have a yeast that we did capture from this facility. That yeast is very distinct. We use it for products at Spirits of French Lick. I will make it available to other distillers throughout the state because it is a piece of Hoosier heritage that all distillers should have access to. But from there, they would boil their water in a large copper kettle called a boiler, which is what this is. Now this would have been set inside some masonry and had a furnace underneath of it, which would have been fed off of wood in order to heat the water and get it boiling. After that water was up to boiling, there was a drain cock on the side of this. Now this drain cock on this particular one has at some point in time been covered over, but they would drain the water into wooden buckets made by the cooper here at the village, and that water would have been then dumped into the fermentation vessel that they would have used to begin the fermentation process. I'll walk around to the backside here. So one of the beautiful things about the old Daisy Spring Distillery, the Spring Mill Distillery, that you may not know, is that a lot of the items that are here are extant, meaning that there are a lot of artifacts here that are original to the operation. This is one of them. Now this has been repaired with some modern banding on it, but this is a 120-gallon hogshead barrel. This is what they would have used for fermentation. This is actually where we were able to swab some of these old staves, and you can see that they are very well worn across the top. This is where we were able to swab and gather some yeast. There are various bits and pieces of these old hogshead fermenters around this old distillery. In fact, in the recreation still that they have here, that's based more on a moonshine design than a traditional alembic of the time, the serpentine coil, the condenser, is actually housed in staves, a barrel made of staves from one of the old hogsheads. We also sampled from this one. If you look, you can tell these bands are old. They're hand beat, hand drilled. Those are original bandings for this distillery. In the earliest days before Indiana became a state, merchants knew that distilling was going to be a big deal because of the number of mills, the agricultural fertility of southern Indiana, and the fact that there would be excess crops grown, and those crops would have to have something done with them. Probably they would be distilled because once they were distilled, they were much easier to move and less likely to spoil. In fact, they didn't spoil, so they were often distilled. That said, for a period of about 30 years, from the late 1700s up to about 1820 or so, off of the bank of the Ohio River in Madison, Indiana, there was a flatboat. That flatboat dealt in one item and one item only, and it was moored in place, and that item was distillation equipment. Now, they sold a lot of small alembic stills, copper pot stills, round turnip-shaped stills. Most of those would have went to farmers going into southern Indiana to claim land and make use of the abundant fruit that was already here, planted by the natives, and or to make use of all the grain that would be coming in through the mills. Almost everything was done on trades back in those days. So you'd bring in so many bushels of grain, and instead of trading cash or money for that, which most people didn't have in those times, they would trade you. So if you brought them, call it 8 shares of corn, they might keep 3 shares of that corn. When you got your corn back, you could have it back as corn meal, or you could have it back as liquor. The mills themselves didn't actually need all of that extra grain, even though they had animals on hand that could be fed and that they could also ship milled grain downriver. What they could use that grain for, though, was to make more liquor to ship out to make more money, and that's what many of them did. Now, many of the early farm distillers could only afford a very small copper still, and so they turned to something called running on a log. Now, I have no way to prove that what I'm about to show you is what I think that it possibly could be. I'm simply speculating here based on the history that I know. But one of the things that these early small distillers did is they needed what was called a stripping still, which is a larger size still, in order to reduce the volume of beer and or wine they had when it was distilled into a manageable quantity, and then to redistill that a second time to take it to a higher proof and a higher quality. In order to do that, it required them to have 2 pot stills. Well, if they could only afford one little copper pot, one of the things that they could do was find a hollowed out beech tree or hollow out a tree on their own. They called it running on a log. We'll move this back out of the way for a moment. And the way that running on a log worked was you would hollow out your tree. You might have enough copper to make a top out of or a cap. What you would do then is you would either place some sort of small steam boiler based off of a wood stove with some type of steam piping through the cap and into the actual still body itself. Often this was done using the small still they already had on hand and the serpentine coil and or what you would call the condenser of that still, filling that small still with water, putting it on a wood stove, heating it so that the steam would come across through the cap into the wooden bodied still, heat up the beer or the wine that was in here without scorching it, cause this to begin to boil, and they would have a secondary line come up and over to a condenser where they could condense that back down into a liquid. And that's often what they use for a stripping still, was a wooden bodied still. Now, the main reason I think that this may have been what that was at one point in time is because if you look around the top of this, you will see that it has had something tacked to it once upon a time. This would have been about the right size to use the hogshead fermenters they had on hand here, the 120-gallon hogshead fermenters, in order to distill. I only know of one copper pot still here on site, and so it might make sense that at least in the early days, William Dalton and others may have been running on a log here at this site, which is pretty rare. If this is in fact what this body is, and it's not just a grain bin, which it could be, that makes it the only one that I know of in the state of Indiana that I've ever seen in person. The layout of a lot of the old distilleries was pretty similar to what this building is now. And we know that when the, I believe it was the Army Corps of Engineers came in here to begin to transform this valley into a state park, they obviously rebuilt a lot of buildings, brought in some new buildings, etc. What we understand now is that this is actually may actually be the same logs, the same building, etc. as what was previously here, just rebuilt a little bit. Now, in those early days, distilleries were typically of 2 floors and everything was based on gravity. So one side, the production side, was an earthen floor, laid down low. The other side was elevated by a couple of steps. We do have some recreations of blueprints of the distillery as it stood, which show it laid out exactly like this, with this elevated floor being the fermentation floor, meaning that basically what was up there were all the fermentation vats, the 120-gallon hogshead fermenters, and that's where they would set their fermentations. The reason that that floor was elevated, they didn't have any pumps at the time. A little easier to get that thick mash downhill and to the still from an elevated position than it is from up off the ground on the same level that you're working. With that said, often a pot still like this, which we talked about momentarily ago, would have a slop arm, which this did. That's what that is at the bottom, a drain essentially to get rid of what you didn't need. And that often tied into some sort of a trough. That trough would have run across the floor and outside of this building, probably around where that door is somewhere, where livestock could make use of it. Now we know that there were always pigs running around this village, and in fact if you ever go look at the mill, you will actually be able to look at the limestone corners of the mill and see that they're rounded off. Those stones weren't made that way. Those stones were actually rounded off by the hogs that were running around the village. Those hogs and other livestock, probably cattle, would have been fed off of the distillery refuse, not fresh grain from the mill. And the reason for that is fresh grain from the mill was going to be used for 2 purposes, human consumption and whiskey production. When you actually ferment and distill that grain, you don't lose any of the protein, so it still has all of its feed value. So you're actually able, with a mill, to get multiple lines of income. The first being human consumption of grain, the second being localized trade and or cash for said products, as well as downriver trade. You can start a distillery, start making whiskey and brandy, start trading commodities for that as well. And you can also produce pork. Then you can send flatboats out downriver, loaded with various grades of flour, various grades of pork, and various grades of whiskey that are all going to bring different monetary income to you later. One of the very interesting engineering aspects of the old Daisy Spring Distillery is that it of course ran off of the same flume and the same limestone water source that runs the mill. Everything in those days was hydro-powered, pretty typically, and people got pretty ingenious with a lot of it. One of the things they got ingenious with, and this is kind of a small recreation of it, but it's not exactly what would have been here. In this back corner off of the flume that also again feeds the mill, inside the distillery there was a large box built. And the reason it was built was it better helped them to distribute the water power that they needed and the water pressure they needed for the various chores they had here at the distillery. Somewhere I do have a gallonage for that particular box off the top of my head. I cannot remember what it was, but I can tell you that they would have been using that water, A, to obviously do their fermentations, B, to cool their coil for their still or stills, and C, to clean their barrels, etc. But one of the other things they may have been using that power for is there were some various patents that were made very early on in the U.S. on distilling equipment. One of the biggest problems with running a pot still over an open flame is that it does not allow you to include solids in your distillation process. Because of that, you run the risk of scorching your whiskey or burning it and making it unusable. One of the really neat features of this still is this. This could be a pop-off valve. I'm not going to say that it isn't. And basically a pop-off valve is there to release any pressure that might build up in the still. This valve would have been covered with a piece of wood and or cork that was vapor tight but would pop out if the still got too hot and got too pressurized. But the other thing I have seen ports like this made for before is the inclusion of what's called a rummager, basically a blending mechanism or a mixing arm, an agitator, which keeps solids moving in the still and keeps them from scorching and burning to the bottom. They may in fact have at one point in time have had a rummager on this piece of equipment so that way they could run their grain and all into the still, which would have upped their production, gave them more proof gallons for every run that they made, and would have allowed them to get the most flavor out of the grains and or fruit that they were using. Thank you guys for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed it and you learned a few things about the distilling history of Southern Indiana. Please support Spring Mill State Park where and how you can, and help us to take care of this great natural resource in the Hoosier State. Thank you guys.